So we're now on to our third metric, and we are talking about the vertical vegetation structure. So this is all about how much diversity your site has in stature. So do you have a site that's all short herbaceous? Do you have a site that's a mix of herbaceous and shrubby and trees? And that's really what we're looking at here. And this is really important because this complexity of structure across the site becomes it's sort of another, I mean, we've already looked at the horizontal structure as an indication of how diverse the patches are, but this is very important. That vertical structure patch stuff is very, very important for birds and for wildlife in general. It also does indicate that you've got a good functioning hydrology and hydrologic system, because that vertical structure is usually generated by that. But one of the real drivers for this metric, we don't measure any direct animal metrics in the RAM because animals, you can't measure them rapidly. They come and go from a site. But this metric in particular is one of them that really tries to look at that habitat available for animals. And so when you've got more vertical structure diversity on your site, you've got more habitat for wildlife and more different kinds of wildlife. Especially birds can be very particular about the types of structures they use for nesting and for feeding. And so that diversity of structures is super important. It also usually indicates, again, biotic diversity and that you've got multiple plant life forms. So remember, we allow young trees to be in that short woody category. And so sometimes your short woodies are indicating you've got good reproduction, although we do have a metric that talks particularly about that in a minute. We'll talk about that one. So what do we use for this vertical structure types? We're going to slide 19. Remember when we were filling in the polygon worksheet, worksheet 5, and we had a vertical structure type that we were filling in, and I was just telling you, oh, it's okay, it's a vertical structure type 2, it's a vertical structure type 6W. Well, now I'm going to tell you all about those. So the first two structure types we have on this slide are the ones for the forest, for the tall woody types. So these are where you have trees that are over 20 feet tall, and you've got two different options when you've got a forest. So you know you're standing in a site that has tall woodies. They're over 20 feet tall. Is more than 20% of your site, or 25% of your canopy, sorry. So you're going to pick one of these two. Vertical structure type 1, VST1, is for when you've got a lot of mid-story canopy as well. So you've got your trees, and you also have either tall shrubs or young trees underneath that are giving you a lot of the mid-canopy structure, which is from about 1.5 meters up to that 20, up to the 6 meters, which up to the 20 feet. So that intermediate layer has a lot of woody structure in it, and that would be a VST1. And so you'll see we have very specific definitions here, and these are going to be in the field guide, and they're also in your reference sheets, which you should be taking out in the field with you. So if you forget which vertical structure types are which, you can look at the reference sheet, and there's a nice little figure in there that gives you the name of each type and the rules for how you can tell when you've got it. So for a VST1, you've got trees that are over 20 feet tall, over 6 meters, that are at least 25% of your stand, and you have short woodies between 1.5 meters and 6 meters tall that are also within over 25% of the canopy of that polygon. Versus your other forest type, VST2, which is you still have the trees at 25%. You have the tall woodies at over 25%, but you don't have that middle woody layer. You can have a super, super short one, which is unlikely. You could have, but you can have shrubs like snakeweed or something that's under 1.5 meters, or you can have a lot of herbaceous that's under 1.5 meters, but you don't have that mid-layer woody in a VST2. Okay, so let's go on now to slide 20, which is our two short woody vegetation structure types. And we have two of those. We have a tall shrubland, which is a VST5, and we have a short shrubland, which is a VST6S. And here you don't have your tall woodies. You might have a single tree in a shrub stand, but you don't have 25% tree cover. You do have 25% woody under 20 feet tall, under 6 meters. And the distinguishing feature here is, are those short woodies between 1.5 meters and 6 meters, between about 4.5 feet and 20 feet, or are they all under 1.5 meters, under 4.5 feet? So The VST5 is going to be things like coyote willow stands or other types of tall woody or tall willow stands, versus the short will be things like if you have a sagebrush terrace that's a dry, historic terrace, you might have a short shrubland. So those are the two shrub types. Now we're going to go to the last three types, which is slide 21. And here we have two herbaceous types, and remember I talked, we have bare ground as an option. There's always the potential for bare ground. And so we have two herbaceous types and a bare ground structure type. And the VST6W, the herbaceous wetlands, is the only time the structure type also asks you to look at what species there are. All the other structure types are just about, is it woody or not woody? How tall is it? VST6W is not only is it herbaceous, but it's 10% herbaceous cover, and not trees and not shrubs, and these are wetland obligate species or facultative wetland species. And you can get that whether if you've had wetland delineation, you should already know your obligate species and your facultative, but that's also available from the USDA website, but it's also available in the appendix that we give you with the species list at the back of the field guide that has all the species that we've commonly encountered while developing the RAM. And so you have to not just have an herbaceous cover, you have to have an herbaceous cover that's dominated by these wetland facultative and wetland obligates. Versus any other herbaceous, we don't care what else, it's just not wetland. That's a VST6H, and that's just any other herbaceous cover that's out there. It could be grasses, it could be tumbleweeds, it's just not wetland obligate. And then the final type, VST7, is for bare ground, which should be obvious. And the rule here, you'll notice it's 10% instead of 25%. So for all the woodies, you need to have 25% cover to move into a woody category. For the herbaceous, you don't call it bare ground until it has less than 10% total cover of anything. And then how do you rate that? Hang on. So now we go to slide 22. What do we do with all these vertical structure types once we've given them all to our polygons, right? On worksheet 5, we gave every polygon a structure type. And we assigned every polygon to a community type, and we gave that community type a percentage that it is of the sample area. So we're going to use all of that to rate. And the other thing that goes into the rating is we decided some of these structure types are more critically important for wildlife than others, especially, again, there are certain birds that, a lot of riparian and wetland birds that just love that really high structure forest. That's really important for them for nesting and or foraging. So the structure types are not equally weighted. The overall weighting is based on diversity of structure types and quality, and certain structure types got higher quality ratings than others. So that high structure forest, the one that has that intermediate canopy of woodies as well as the tall woodies, is rated the highest. Then low structure forest, tall shrublands, and wetland herbaceous are intermediate because they're all important different types of riparian, but they're a little bit more limited in the amount of structure they provide individually. And finally, the short shrublands, which often indicate some drying, and the herbaceous vegetation that's not wetland, can be any kinds of thing, and bare ground are given the lowest ratings in the wetland, in the ratings table. So that the whole ratings table is built on complexity and quality. So we're going to go to the next slide, slide 23, and you'll see, again, if you're using the activated PDF data sheets, you get a lot of help from the data sheets. And once you've filled in worksheet 5 and worksheet 6, the data sheet will give you at the top here the percent of each structure type that you have for your sample area. So this is just a screenshot on slide 23 from our data sheet that we just filled in for our example site, showing that we have 45% of the VST to the low structure tall woody type. We have 40% tall shrubland, VST5, and we have 5% short shrubland and 10% herbaceous wetlands that comprise our example site. And then below that is the ratings table. And this ratings table, so what the activated PDF data sheet can do for you is calculate that percentage. If you, for some reason, you didn't have it, you'd actually have to go by hand and figure out how much tall structure, or how much tall high structure type do I have, how much of the VST2, how much of the VST5. You would have to hand calculate that. But with the activated one, hopefully that's what you're using, and then you don't have to hand calculate that. But then you have to take those numbers and go to the ratings table. And the ratings table requires a human to do it. We can't teach the machine to do this because it's so many if-then statements. It's not that hard, but you do have to follow the directions and go by the rules through the ratings table. And what you do is you always start at the top of the ratings table. So you're always going to read this down, not up, because if you read from the bottom up, a lot of sites that would rate a 4 could also rate a 1 because they might have some not very high quality structure types mixed in. But what we're really caring about is how much high quality structure you have. So you always start at the top of the ratings table and read down, because sometimes things that have that are very high quality vertical structure type, they might also have a bunch of other not so high quality stuff. So a lot of you don't ever read this from the bottom up and go, oh, well, I meet the quality for a 1, we're done. You always start at the top in the A and say, do I meet this? And if I don't, well, then I go down to the 2 and say, do I meet this? And if I don't meet that, then I go down to the 3 and say, do I meet that? And then you only get to the 1 if you've gone through all the others and gone, ugh, none of these fit. So for a 4, you have 3 possible ways to get a 4. You have a high structure forest type, VST1, and a high structure herbaceous, or not high structure, and a tall shrubland, and some kind of herbaceous. You'll notice it says 6W and or 6H. Doesn't matter, you just have herbaceous. So basically it's saying, hey, you have high quality or high structure forest and shrublands and some other herbaceous patches. And so it's saying, okay, well, you've got this nice forest and you've got a mix of other types of patches, yay. Or another way to get that is you've got that high structure forest type and 6W at least 15% of your area. So the other thing about these columns is that dominant one is what's the most common thing you've got. And the second column is, do you have at least 15% of this thing in the second column? And the third column is, do you have at least 5% of what's in this third column? So basically we said, hey, if you've got high quality forest and you've got herbaceous wetland, wow, that's a really nice wetland, you get an A. Or there's yet a third way to get a 4, and that is you have either all low structure forest or a mix of forest types. So it says 2 or 1 and 2, so you can lump your 1 and 2 cover together, because we didn't want you to toss the forest types, even though you had, let's say you had 45% of forest on your whole sample area, but 20 of it was high structure and 25 of it was low. Well, we didn't want you to boot that down and say, well, we don't have any forest types that are dominant, because together you do. So you have either all 2 or 1 and 2 mixed together, and you have the tall shrublands, and you have some herbaceous patches. Well, it so happens that our example site fits into that, right? Because we have 45% 2, which is the low structure forest. So we've got that 2. And we have 40% 5, which is the tall shrubland. So we meet that 15% cutoff for the 5. And we have 10% herbaceous wetland. So we meet the 5% cutoff for that third column. So in this example, we have a 4. But let's say we didn't have any herbaceous on our site. Then we would have to go down to the 3 and start looking at the columns there, and we would end up saying, oh, well, we have 2 and we have 5, so we rate a 3. So really, to get below a 3, you have to basically just have 1 structure type mostly, and it's not very exciting. So for 2s, if you just have forest types, or you just have tall shrubland, or you just have herbaceous wetland, you get a 2. But you have nothing else, basically. And then to get a 1, you only have short shrubs, you only have herbaceous non-wetland, or you only have bare ground, or you only have a mixture of those 3. The other thing is that when you only have high structure forest, because we did weight it the most heavily as the structure types, it gets a 3 by itself. So if you're in a really dense forest and that's all you have on your whole sample area, it will still get a 3 on the vertical structure type. So hopefully you're all ready to read through that table in the field and rate your site. And that is how you do the vertical structure.